Today we are reading a book called Getting to Know the World's Greatest Composers, George Handel. It has a lot of funny pictures, and so I'll be showing those to you as well. All right, so here is what George Friedrich Handel looks like. Yes, that is a wig for all of you that are wondering. George Friedrich Handel was one of the most famous composers in Europe during the 1700s. He traveled all over Germany and Italy, learning as much as he could about the music of the day. In 1712, George Handel moved to London, England. So he's been to Germany, Italy, and London, England. There he spent the rest of his life composing some of the greatest music ever written. In Germany, George Handel learned about choir music and organ music, which were played in many of the churches there. In Italy, where opera was invented, he learned how songs could be performed beautifully by a single great singing star. He also learned how orchestra music was composed. In England, George learned about important sounding royal music, which was used to celebrate an event or honor a king or queen. George Handel often combined the different musical styles he had studied and included them in his most famous musical pieces. Here's a picture in 1749 to celebrate the signing of an important English peace treaty. Handel composed music for a special fireworks display in Green Park, London. George Friedrich Handel was born in the German town of Halle in 1685. Halle was a lively town while George was growing up. It had lots of places where he could hear music. Organ recitals and choir music were performed at the town's many churches. Town musicians played brass instruments for special occasions, and Halle had lots of street musicians too. George Friedrich Handel also got to meet many interesting people when he was little. People from all over the world came to see his father, who was a well-known barber surgeon. So he was a barber, that's somebody who cuts hair, and he was a surgeon, which is like a doctor. That is very interesting. Here's a picture of some musicians in the 1700s. It's kind of funny, they're on top of each other playing instruments, and they have dogs too. That must be a lively sight. As unusual as it seems today, during the 1600s and 1700s, barbers not only cut hair, but also were trained as doctors to operate on people. George loved music from the time he was very young. Unfortunately, his father didn't care for it at all. Mr. Handel thought music was a waste of time and that musicians could never make a good living. He didn't want George to study music or ever play an instrument. There's a story that tells how George's mother and aunt helped smuggle a harpsichord into the attic so George could practice quietly at night. If you don't know what a harpsichord is, that is like the old version of a piano. It sounds a little bit different though. There's some funny cartoons on these pages, so I'll read those to you. So here on this one, there's his dad, and there's the king, and there's little George, and he's studying his music book. His dad says, "So, Your Highness, did you want your tonsils out today or a haircut?" And the king says, "Just a trim, some off the top and the sides." And then this other one says, "Clink, clank, clink, clank, clink, clank." If you look really close, you'll see his mother and his aunt trying to go up the stairs with that harpsichord. His dad said, "Did you hear something, George?" "No, Father, maybe it was the mice." But it was actually his mom and his aunt. Whether the harpsichord story is true or not, George somehow learned to play music all by himself. When he was 10 years old, his father took him along on a trip to the palace of the Duke of Weissenfels. Yes, that is a very funny word, Weissenfels. While Mr. Handel went about his business, George found an organ in the Duke's chapel and began to play it. The Duke happened to be passing by and could hardly believe his ears. He had never heard such beautiful music being played by such a young boy. The Duke tried to convince Mr. Handel that his talented son deserved a chance to study music. As soon as he got back home, George began taking music lessons, so it worked. The Duke convinced him. There's another cartoon on this page. And the Duke said, or it's a messenger, says, "A message from the Duke. The Duke wishes you would let your son study music more seriously." And his father says, "Oh, sure, of course. I was just saying to young George here how we would get him a music teacher as soon as we get home." His bodyguard looks a little scary too. So apparently it worked. George learned quickly from his teacher, Friedrich Sackau. I'm not really sure if that's how you say it, but it sounds good. Who was one of the best organists in Germany. George became an expert organ and harpsichord player and began composing music. Now, do you remember what a composer is? At this point, when he was 10 years old, he began composing music. He also learned to play the violin and the oboe, so he knows how to play harpsichord, organ, violin, and oboe. George loved music so much that he decided to make it his career. When he was 17 years old, he began traveling to other German cities that were known as important music centers. His first stop was Hamburg. Yes, it does kind of sound like hamburger, but it's Hamburg, where he got his first job as a violinist and a harpsichord player with the city's opera orchestra. So here is a picture of what Hamburg looked like back in the day. Operas were the top entertainment in Europe during Handel's time. They were as popular as movies are today. People loved to spend evenings listening to great singers and watching them act out a story with beautiful costumes and scenery. So they made a cartoon that made operas look like a movie theater. I don't think it actually looked like this, but it's pretty fun. So it's this couple arguing on, what do you want to see? I don't know. What do you want to see? Everyone loved to go see operas. They couldn't wait to find out what special effects the stage designers would come up with next. Sometimes the designers built machines that were able to show volcanoes or shipwrecks or strange supernatural scenes. While he was in Hamburg, George met a talented singer and composer named Johan Madison. Johan Madison, don't forget his name. Johan and George became best of friends and helped each other with their music. Once, however, they had a serious argument and got into a duel with swords. The argument started when both of them wanted to play the harpsichord during an opera that Johan had written. George Handel could be very stubborn, especially when it came to music. Fortunately, no one was seriously hurt during the fight, and George and Johan soon became friends. In fact, Johan helped George write his first opera. It was called Almira and became a big hit right away. So here's a cartoon of their sword fight that they had. Do you see them there with their swords? And this couple is kind of standing by and watching all of this happen. And the guy says, "Who are those guys?" And the woman says, "Oh, they're best friends and sensitive composers who write some of the most beautiful operas." Obviously, they didn't look like best friends right then, but they were. George was happy about his success, but decided to leave Germany and go to Italy. Remember, that's the second place he traveled, and learn more about operas. So he went to Italy to learn more about operas. Italian operas were the most popular type in Europe. Italy had more opera houses and great singers than anywhere else in the world. While living there, George met and studied the music of such famous composers as Alessandro Scarlatti, Arcangelo Corelli, and in Venice, Italy, George composed his first Italian opera. It became a big hit too. So here's a picture of what Venice, this is in Italy, would look like back in the 1700s. Lots of boats and water around. It's very beautiful. George Friedrich Handel started to become famous all over Europe. In 1710, the ruler of the German state of Hanover, George Ludwig, heard about Handel. He asked him to head up his royal music department. George accepted the job, but soon after asked to be excused so that he could go to London, England. Remember, that's the third place he traveled, London, England, where he had been invited to write operas. During the 1700s, England was behind the rest of Europe when it came to opera. People there were anxious to see and hear Italian operas, like the ones George Friedrich Handel was writing. So here's a picture of George Handel going to the Royal Music Department. And George Ludwig says, "I'd like everyone's attention. Our new music director has something to say before he begins working with us." And then George is over here. "Good luck, everyone. See you in a year or two." So he accepted a job and then just kind of ran off. During his first few years in England, George Handel wrote many successful operas. He was even able to start his own opera company. But then something happened. Slowly, people began losing interest in operas. The English people were becoming tired of listening to Italian songs that they couldn't understand and stories that were usually very complicated. Many of the opera stars had become spoiled and demanded huge amounts of money to sing. Sometimes they even got into fights right on the stage. George Handel started losing money and had to close his opera company. He became discouraged, but he did not give up. George Handel started composing a different kind of music that he hoped his audience would enjoy more. So this is probably the best cartoon in this book. So here is all of the opera stars on stage in England. And here's some of the things that are happening on the stage. These two girls, "I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest." And then this man, "You have the voice of a frog." And this girl, "My big toe is more beautiful than your face." They are not saying nice things to each other. And there's some people in the audience. This woman says, "That does it. We're never coming here again." And her husband says, "Why? This is the first time I've ever enjoyed an opera." Look at all of that craziness going on. That is why George had to close his opera company, but he started writing a new kind of music. George Handel began writing oratorios. Now, here's how I like to remember this word. Oratorios reminds me of Oreos. Oratorios. An oratorio is similar to an opera, so they're kind of similar, except that a chorus, instead of one or two great singing stars, sings most of the music. Also, oratorios don't have acting, costumes, or scenery. If you look really close, I want you to see how many people in this picture are singing the music. Can you see that? Look at all of those people in the choir. So oratorios used big choirs. Usually George Handel wrote his oratorios about exciting stories from the Bible. The songs were sung in English so that everyone in London could understand what was going on. Remember, that's why they didn't like operas, because they couldn't understand Italian. People loved Handel's new music. One reason his oratorios became so popular was that Handel had a special talent. He had a special talent for creating music that helps you picture a story in your mind. Part of a famous Handel oratorio called Israel in Egypt tells how Moses, with the help of God, sent millions of flies to irritate the Egyptian Pharaoh. Moses did this to convince the Pharaoh to stop using the people of Israel as slaves. The high voices in the women's chorus members and the quick rhythms of the violins used in this piece lets you almost see and feel the pesky flies swarming all over the place. Handel also composed music just for instruments, so no singers, just instruments. It's easy to picture the excitement and grandness of a royal boat party on in his famous orchestra work called Water Music. Handel wrote the water music for his old boss, George Ludwig of Germany, who had become King George I, King of England, in 1714. So here's a picture of what a royal boat party might have looked like. And as you look closer, see if you can find the boat that you think the king would be riding on. I think it's the big red or green boat myself. Oh, we're getting to my favorite part. George Friedrich Handel's most famous piece is an oratorio called Messiah. It is about the life of Jesus Christ. The words that were sung in it came right out of the Bible. Messiah was first performed in Dublin, Ireland. It was written to help raise money for poor people, the same way many concert performances do today. Handel felt deeply inspired when he wrote his most famous work. He used everything he had learned in the past. When you listen to Messiah, you can hear a combination of Italian opera style, English orchestra music, and German church music. The piece also includes many different moods, from very happy to very solemn. So many people in Dublin were anxious to hear Messiah that newspapers there printed up ads asking women not to wear their usual hooped skirts and men not to wear their swords. They wanted to make sure there was room for everyone in the music hall. So that was a style back then. These women would wear these really big hooped skirts, and the men would wear these big swords off their side. So here's a picture, and the man says, "Do you think anyone will notice? I hope not. This is my only decent dress I own." So you see the big hooped skirt and the swords? They take up a lot of room. Even though Messiah was very successful in Ireland, it didn't go over very well back in London. Church leaders there didn't like the idea of having any kind of entertainment about the life of Jesus. They tried to convince people that Messiah was disrespectful and they shouldn't see it. George decided it might be better to perform his oratorio just once a year for charity. George Friedrich Handel was a very generous person. He donated lots of his time to raise money for poor people. His favorite charity was the Foundling Hospital. The Foundling Hospital took care of babies who had no parents. For many years, Handel performed his Messiah right in the hospital. So this is a funny picture. It's all the babies of the hospital all over the place. George Handel says, "Before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone for their patience." Look at where all of those babies are. There's babies everywhere. They're on the drums and the violins and the trumpets. The choir members are holding babies. Lots of babies. Our final page. In April of 1759, after giving a performance of the Messiah, George Friedrich Handel became ill. That means he became sick. He died 8 days later at the age of 74. Even though he composed many well-loved operas, oratorios, and orchestra pieces, the Messiah was his favorite. Eventually, the Messiah became appreciated in London. Today, it is considered one of the world's greatest musical masterpieces. It's pretty easy to find Handel's music on the radio or on YouTube. At Christmas time, some cities put on special performances of the Messiah in which the public is invited to join in the chorus. Thank you for reading with me and joining in on our composer lesson today.